This is the brief on the Philippines Art Forgery Act of 2001. Republic Act number 9105 protects the nation's cultural heritage by defining art forgery, verifying authenticity, and harshly punishing fakers. It's basically a national immune system against fake masterpieces. To stop fakes, you first need to know who has the authority to spot them. First, the law creates the Art Authentication Panel. Picture them as the Supreme Court of the canvas. This three-member panel under the National Museum Board of Trustees must be Filipino citizens, at least 35 years old, and experts in art history, conservation, or connoisseurship. They serve 2-year terms, up to 2 consecutive terms. Now that we have the experts to spot the fakes, what actually happens to the fakers? Second, severe penalties. Forgers face 6 to 12 years in prison and fines between 50,000 and 500,000 pesos. Crucially, if a company commits forgery, the CEO takes the fall. If art dealers or gallery owners are involved, they automatically lose their license. Does the threat of instantly losing a gallery license force the elite art market to completely self-police? While catching high-end fakes and enforcing these rules requires serious resources. Finally, the funding. The act appropriates a massive 50 million pesos for the equipment, supplies, and expertise needed to enforce the law. Plus, any money the panel collects goes right back to the National Museum. The government is literally putting its money where its mouth is, because you can't catch a brilliant forgery without buying some seriously high-tech gear. Ultimately, Republic Act 9105 arms the Philippines with the exact experts, financial backing, and legal teeth needed to keep its artistic history authentic.
This video provides an executive briefing on the Art Forgery Act of 2001, also known as Republic Act number 9105. This legislation was enacted on April 14, 2001, and establishes the legal, structural, and punitive frameworks for fine art authentication in the Philippines. The core mandate of this act is to protect, conserve, develop, and promote the nation's cultural heritage, artistic creations, and resources. This establishes that art is not merely commerce, but is a legally protected national resource, as stated in Section 2, Declaration of Policy. The institutional authority flows from the Board of Trustees of the National Museum, which are the ultimate arbiters. They mandate the search committee, which is the vetting mechanism. Finally, the Art Authentication Panel is the execution arm, assuming the active powers of authentication. To be an authenticator, an individual must be a Filipino citizen and at least 35 years old. They must hold a degree or equivalent experience in specific art disciplines. Crucially, they must possess competence, integrity, probity, and independence of mind. Compensation is on a per diem basis to establish a boundary against commercial salaries. Authenticators are appointed for a strict 2-year term, capped at a maximum of 2 consecutive terms. If a member fills a vacancy, they serve the unexpired remainder of that term, but this is counted as 1 full term toward their 2-term maximum. The Act establishes a mandatory baseline of punishment for forgery, with no minor infractions. Imprisonment ranges from a minimum of 6 years and 1 day to a maximum of 12 years. Financial penalties range from a minimum of 50,000 pesos to a maximum of 500,000 pesos. Structural liability applies across the art ecosystem. Individual forgers face direct liability. For corporate entities, liability transfers upward to the CEO or responsible officials, dissolving the corporate shield. For art galleries and dealers, forgery results in the automatic revocation of their license. The Act creates a self-sustaining engine of cultural defense. The initial seed of 50 million pesos is appropriated for equipment and expertise. Market authentication by the panel generates operational fees, which augment the National Museum's appropriations. This loop transforms market regulation into institutional capitalization.
All right, let's talk about a law. But hold on, this isn't some dry piece of legislation about taxes or traffic. This is the Art Forgery Act of 2001, and it's basically a shield designed to protect a country's entire cultural memory. So how exactly does it work? Let's dive in. You know that feeling? You're standing in a gallery, just captivated by a masterpiece. But then a little question pops into your head. How do we know it's real? Authenticity is everything, and what happens when the fakes get so good that they actually threaten to rewrite history itself? And this gets us right to the heart of the matter. We usually think of art forgery as, someone losing a bunch of money on a bad investment. But the real problem, the real danger, goes so much deeper than that. See, what's really at stake here isn't just someone's bank account. It's the national story. Just imagine a fake painting, It's supposed to be from a really important time in history. Maybe it shows a big event, but that event never actually happened. If that fake is accepted as real, it starts to poison the past. It's a lie that literally gets woven into a country's story. And hey, don't just take my word for it. This isn't just some philosophical concept. This quote is pulled directly from the law's Declaration of Policy. It says right there in black and white that the government's job is to protect, conserve, develop, and promote the nation's cultural heritage. That makes forgery a direct assault on an official mission. So if the problem is that big, a threat to the nation itself, then the response has to be just as serious. Let's take a look at the specific tool that was created to fight back. So here it is, Republic Act 9105. Most people just call it the Art Forgery Act of 2001. And its purpose is simple but incredibly powerful, to officially define art forgery as a crime against the state. And this is the crucial part, to build the actual system needed to fight it. Okay, and this is where the law gets really, really smart. Because it's one thing to just say, hey, forgery is illegal. It's a whole other thing to create a specific group of people whose job it is to be the ultimate authority. So who are these official art detectives? They're called the Art Authentication Panel, a pretty simple name for a group with a massive responsibility to look at a piece of art and deliver the final, official word on whether it's the real deal or a total fake. Now, the way this panel is set up is all about focus and deep expertise. It's deliberately small, just 3 members, and they're appointed by the National Museum's Board of Trustees. They serve for 2 years at a time and can only serve 2 terms in a row. It's a clever structure, really, because it ensures you have consistency, but you're also constantly bringing in fresh perspectives. And getting onto this panel isn't easy. They don't just pick names out of a hat. There's a formal process. First, a search committee goes out and finds the absolute best people for the job. Then they create a short list of nominees. From that list, the National Museum's board makes the final decision. The whole thing is designed to be rigorous and totally impartial. And when I say they look for the best people, I mean it. The qualifications are incredibly strict. You have to be a citizen, you have to be at least 35, and you need a rock-solid reputation for integrity. But here's the kicker. You also need a degree, or at least equivalent experience, in super specific fields like art history, art conservation, or connoisseurship. These aren't just art lovers. These are the top-tier, vetted experts who live and breathe this stuff. Okay, so you've got this elite panel of experts, which is great. But a law doesn't mean much if it doesn't have some real consequences, right? Well, trust me, this law has teeth. Big, sharp ones. It's the one question every potential forager ought to be asking. Let's say the Art Authentication Panel has taken a look at your work and, yep, it's a fake. What's next? First up, prison time. And we're not talking about a slap on the wrist. The law mandates a sentence of at least 6 years and 1 day, and it can go all the way up to 12 years. Just like that, art forgery is elevated from a minor issue to a major felony. And on top of that long prison sentence, they hit you in the wallet hard. There's a hefty fine of up to 500,000 pesos. The idea is to make forgery not just a huge personal risk, but a complete financial disaster. What's also really smart about this law is how broad its scope is. It doesn't just chase after the individual artist. If a corporation is involved, the CEO can be held responsible. And for art dealers or galleries, the consequences are a total career ender. Beyond the jail time and the fines, their license to operate is automatically and permanently revoked. Game over. So as we start to wrap this up, let's just pull back for a second and look at the big picture again. Why does a law like this matter so much? Because when you get right down to it, it was never really just about the art market. Think about it this way. A country's art is its memory made visible. It's the physical evidence of its story, its wins, its losses, its identity. Every authentic piece is like a page in that story. And this law, at its very core, is a shield forged to protect that collective memory from being corrupted by lies. So if you boil it all down, the Art Forgery Act really stands on 3 powerful pillars. First, there's protection, a clear official statement that protecting cultural heritage is a national priority. Second, authentication, a credible, expert-driven system for actually finding the truth. And third, punishment, serious consequences to make sure everybody respects the law. And that leaves us with one last big question, doesn't it? This law was written back in 2001 for a world of canvas and paint. But today, we've got AI that can generate unbelievably convincing fakes in seconds in a booming digital art market. So in this new reality, is the fundamental fight to protect authenticity, to protect a nation's story, more critical than ever? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this one.
Imagine a billionaire spends, let's say, 50 million pesos on a newly discovered masterwork.
Oh, right. The ultimate find.
Exactly. Like a lost canvas by some legendary national artist. So the piece is unveiled at this massive gala.
Yeah, lots of champagne.
Lots of champagne, lots of press. It gets hung in a really prestigious museum, right? And art historians immediately start rewriting their textbooks.
Because they have to include this crucial missing link in the nation's cultural history.
Yeah, it's celebrated. I mean, it is officially canon.
But then reality hits.
Right. Then a state-funded scientist walks into that same gallery, shines an ultraviolet light across the canvas, and takes this tiny microscopic squape in a white brushstroke.
Just a speck of paint.
Just a speck. And proves unequivocally that the specific chemical compound in that paint was actually manufactured in a factory in like 1995.
Wow. Yeah, that changes things.
The entire historical narrative just shatters instantly.
Yeah.
So the question is, what happens next?
Who actually takes the fall?
Exactly. Who goes to jail? Is it the painter hiding out in the basement? Is it the slick gallery owner who brokered the deal? Today on The Deep Dive, we are looking at how a nation actually goes to war to defend its historical truth.
And, it is a brutal, high-stakes battleground. People really tend to romanticize art forgery.
Oh, absolutely.
Like we picture those slick Hollywood heist movies.
Yeah, shadowy figures in velvet suits, swapping canvases in Swiss chalet.
Exactly, but the reality is just far more clinical. And the legal response to it is this grinding, highly engineered machine.
Fascinating.
It really is. We are looking at the blueprint for one of those machines today, specifically Republic Act number 9105,
right,
also known as the Art Forgery Act of 2001 from the Philippines.
Because, when you look at standard crimes, there's a comforting visibility to
Sure,
them.
like a physical impact.
Yeah, a stolen car, a broken window, an embezzled bank account. The damage is physical or financial, and the victim is clearly defined.
The math is easy.
But the moment you step into the realm of cultural heritage, that clear-cut landscape just vanishes completely.
Oh, it gets incredibly murky.
You are dealing with these diagnostic muddy waters where the crime itself is an illusion masquerading as a national treasure.
And the challenge for any government, really, is figuring out how to build a tangible legal framework around an illusion.
Right. How do you legislate against a ghost?
Exactly. And this specific law enacted on April 14th, 2001 is just a fascinating masterclass in doing exactly that.
It really lays it all out.
It shows exactly how a state mobilizes its bureaucracy, its penal code, and its national treasury to identify a lie and punish the liar.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning. Let's start with the foundation.
The philosophy behind it all.
Right. So the very beginning of the document sets up this declaration of policy, and it explicitly states that it's the policy of the state to, quote, protect, conserve, develop, and promote the nation's cultural heritage, artistic creations, and resources.
It's a very strong opening statement.
It sounds incredibly noble to call it heritage. But realistically, and I have to play devil's advocate here, isn't this usually just a state-sponsored protection racket for billionaire collectors who got scammed?
That's a common criticism, yeah.
Because, if a wealthy private citizen buys a fake painting to hang in their private mansion, why should the state care enough to build an entire legal apparatus around it?
Well, because the state recognizes that a forgery is not a localized financial crime.
What do you mean by localized?
So in standard property fraud, let's say a con artist sells a fake vintage watch. The victim is just the buyer.
Right, the damage is isolated to one person's bank account.
Exactly. But artistic creations are different. They are the physical manifestations of a nation's identity.
Oh, wow.
So when a forgery enters the accepted canon of a master painter, it literally pollutes the cultural archive.
It's like a virus in the database.
Yes. It distorts the understanding of the past for generations.
So it's essentially cultural treason. You aren't just stealing money, you are rewriting the nation's history with a lie.
That's exactly how they see it.
If historians believe a revered 19th century artist painted a specific scene using specific techniques, and that scene is actually a modern fabrication.
The whole academic foundation shakes.
Right. The entire academic and cultural understanding of that era shifts based on false data.
What's fascinating here is that this is the exact philosophical stance the drafters took.
Yeah.
Look really closely at the verbs they chose in that declaration of policy.
Okay. Protect, conserve, develop, promote.
Exactly. The state is legally equating a brushstroke on a canvas with a natural resource.
Wait, really? Like a natural resource?
They are treating a painting with the same national security importance as a freshwater reservoir or, a timber forest.
Which explains a really deliberate structural choice in this document.
The layout of the law itself.
Yeah, because usually penal laws define the crime immediately. You open the book and it says, murder is defined as, or theft is the act of.
To get right to the point.
But here, they lay down this sweeping philosophy of cultural protection before they even define what forgery is.
Right. Section 3, the actual definitions, comes after Section 2, the philosophy.
Yes. The actual mechanics of the crime are pushed back. They force you to read the philosophy first.
And setting the stakes up front like that is vital for the eventual application of the law.
How so?
Because the drafters wanted the ultimate arbiters, the judges handling these cases in court, to be fully steeped in the national importance of the issue.
Oh, so it's framing the judge's mindset.
Exactly. When a gallery owner is sitting in the defendant's chair, the judge isn't viewing it as a simple contract dispute over a piece of decorative furniture.
Right. It's not a breach of contract for a couch.
No. The judge is viewing it as an attack on the soul of the nation.
That is heavy. But, declaring a canvas sacred doesn't automatically protect it.
Sadly, no. Words on paper aren't enough.
You need an actual mechanism to separate the sacred from the fraudulent. And identifying a fake requires a very specific, almost unquantifiable kind of eye.
Which brings us to the core of the machine.
Right, which leads us directly into the creation of the ultimate arbiters. The law completely dismantles an older system from a previous decree and establishes a brand new art authentication panel.
And it is an incredibly focused entity. It consists of exactly 3 members.
3, which honestly is the structural sweet spot.
How do you mean?
Well, 2 gives you a deadlock, right? And 4 gives you a tie. 3 guarantees a verdict.
Yeah.
It's essentially the Supreme Court of Canvas.
I like that. The Supreme Court of Canvas.
But the qualifications for sitting on this panel are hyper-specific. First, they must be citizens of the Philippines.
Which makes perfect sense if you are defending national heritage.
Absolutely. But then there's this, they must be at least 35 years of age on the day of their appointment.
Yes, that age requirement is a profound acknowledgement of what it actually takes to understand art at a forensic level.
It's like the constitutional requirement to run for president. They are demanding a level of lived experience.
They really are.
Because, you could have a 22-year-old prodigy, fresh out of university, someone with a PhD in art history and a photographic memory for 19th century brushstrokes.
A literal genius.
But the law legally disqualifies them. Just flat out no.
Because academic knowledge is only half the equation here.
Right.
You can learn the chemical composition of colonial-era pigments in a laboratory in a few semesters.
Sure, that's just data.
But connoisseurship, that intuitive, almost instinctual alarm bell that rings in your head when something is texturally off about a painting, that takes decades.
It's a gut feeling, but an educated one.
Exactly. It requires standing in front of thousands of canvases, absorbing the subtle, idiosyncratic physical habits of a painter.
So the drafters recognize that true connoisseurship cannot be rushed by raw intellect.
No, it requires the sheer passage of time.
It's the physiological aspect of pattern recognition in the human brain.
Yeah.
You need a massive internal database of authentic brushstrokes just to spot the anomaly.
Precisely. And it also speaks to the psychological maturity required for the role.
Which brings up another wild requirement. The law mandates these 3 individuals possess, quote, proven competence, integrity, probity, and independence of mind.
That phrase is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Why mandate independence of mind in a legal statute? This sounds so poetic for a legal document.
Because the financial gravity of the art market creates an environment of intense coercion.
Okay, paint a picture for me.
Consider the reality of this panel's daily work. A powerful, socially connected collector brings in a painting they just purchased for 50 million pesos.
A huge investment.
If the panel authenticates it, that investment is solidified. It might even be multiplied.
Right.
But if the panel declares it a forgery, that 50 million pesos instantly vaporizes into zero.
Well, the value doesn't just dip, it ceases to exist entirely.
And the gallery that brokered the sale is suddenly exposed to criminal liability.
Oh man. So the stakes are life-rating.
Exactly. The social, political, and financial pressure exerted on those 3 panel members would be astronomical.
I can't even imagine. The threats, the attempted bribery.
The risk of social ostracization from elite circles, it is an incredibly hostile environment to operate in.
So probity isn't just a suggestion, it's a structural necessity. You need individuals who possess the backbone to look a powerful billionaire in the eye and tell them their prized possession is worthless trash.
And you need people who simply do not care about the social fallout.
Which is exactly why the panel members are granted very short, strictly capped term limits.
Yes. They serve for 2 years, and they cannot serve for more than 2 consecutive terms.
That is a total of 4 years maximum.
A very short window.
You spend all this energy finding these hyper-qualified, unbribable 35-plus-year-old paragons of connoisseurship, and then you force them into retirement almost immediately.
This raises an important question, though. Why do it that way?
Yeah, why?
Because if you grant 3 people absolute unchecked power over a multi-million peso national art market for 20 years, you are practically begging for a cartel to form.
Ah, a monopoly on truth.
Precisely. Over a long enough timeline, personal biases become institutionalized.
Right, they just get comfortable.
A panel member might naturally favor certain galleries, or maybe they harbor a subconscious blind spot for a particular style of forgery.
So by enforcing aggressive turnover, the law actively disrupts any deep-seated corruption from taking root.
Exactly. If a criminal gallery owner knows a panel member is only in a position of power for another 18 months, bribing them becomes a terrible, high-risk investment.
It's brilliant. It also prevents the authentication process from intellectually stagnating.
Because art history is an evolving discipline.
Exactly. New historical letters are uncovered, new techniques are understood. By constantly cycling fresh eyes onto the panel, the state ensures the process reflects the most current, cutting-edge understanding of the field.
Rather than being locked into the opinions of someone who made up their mind back in 1985.
But, the creation of this panel introduces a severe logistical vulnerability.
The selection process.
Yes. If these 3 seats hold the power to destroy fortunes and send people to prison, the mechanism for choosing who sits in those seats becomes the most critical point of failure in the entire law.
It's the bottleneck of integrity.
Who guards the guards? Because you can't just have a politician appoint their friends. That immediately politicizes the national heritage.
Which defeats the whole purpose.
So the law built a very specific, layered bureaucracy to handle this.
Section 8, 9, and 10 lay this out.
Right. The ultimate appointing power belongs to the Board of Trustees of the National Museum. But the board isn't allowed to just sit in a room and pick names out of a hat.
They have a mandate.
The law forces the board to create a search committee.
It's the buffer zone. It's a classic, highly effective mechanism of friction.
I love that phrase, mechanism of friction. So the search committee's sole function is to comb through the art world, find qualified candidates, and submit a curated list back to the board.
And this is the key part. The board is legally restricted to making their appointments only from that submitted list.
It thoroughly diffuses the power of appointment.
Exactly. If a corrupt entity wants to stack the authentication panel with cronies, they face a massive bureaucratic hurdle.
They can't just bribe one person.
No. They cannot simply corrupt the board. They would have to first corrupt the search committee to ensure their crony makes the list.
Right.
And then separately, corrupt the board to actually select that specific name from the list.
It's an obstacle course. It's designed to produce rigorously vetted candidates. But just imagine the sheer difficulty of the search committee's actual job.
Oh, it's brutal.
How do you quantify an unquantifiable subjective human skill? You can't put, "I have a really good vibe for fake paintings" on a resume.
You really can't.
They are tasked with turning a subjective instinct into a rigid legal credential.
Which forces the search committee to look far beyond diplomas.
What are they looking at then?
They are evaluating reputations within the whispered networks of the art world.
The gossip, basically.
Professional gossip, yes. They are looking at a candidate's past judgments, their methodology, and their standing among their peers. It requires the search committee themselves to be deeply entrenched in the realities of the market.
So what does this all mean for the people who actually get picked? What is the grand prize for navigating this massive gauntlet?
You would think it's a huge payday.
Right. What do these panel members receive for taking on this immense pressure and the inevitable hostility of powerful people whose investments they ruin?
The law explicitly states their compensation.
Yeah, Section 10 says that members of the search committee, the panel, and any art consultants shall be entitled to receive, quote, per diems.
Daily allowances.
Daily allowances.
Right.
They aren't getting lucrative six-figure government salaries. They're getting reimbursed for their lunch and their commute.
It legally frames this immense responsibility as a form of specialized public service.
It's akin to jury duty.
Exactly, and the meager compensation is actually a deliberate financial filter.
Oh, how so?
Well, if the position offered a massive salary, it would attract opportunists seeking financial reward.
People who just want a paycheck.
Right. And that significantly increases the risk of attracting someone lacking that vital probity we talked about earlier.
That makes total sense. By offering only a per diem, the law ensures it only attracts individuals who are operating out of a profound, intrinsic commitment to the integrity of the nation's art.
It's a calling, not a career.
A calling. But wait, I want to highlight a phrase you just agreed to, tucked into that compensation section.
Which one?
It mentions the search committee, the panel, and art consultants. We haven't talked about these consultants yet. Why does the supreme three-person panel need consultants?
Because the drafters recognize the limits of generalist knowledge.
Okay, explain that.
The art world is simply too vast and chemically complex for any three humans to master entirely.
Even brilliant 35-year-olds.
Exactly. You might assemble a brilliant panel consisting of an expert in 19th century oils, an expert in colonial wood carving, and an expert in modern abstract expressionism.
Sounds like a solid team.
But what happens when they are presented with an incredibly rare pre-colonial artifact woven from specific indigenous fibers?
Oh, they hit a wall.
I hit a wall. The inclusion of art consultants grants the core panel the legal authority to call for backup.
They can bring in a ringer.
Yes, they can identify a hyper-niche specialist, perhaps the only person in the entire country who understands the oxidation process of that specific indigenous fiber.
And bring them into the fold for that one case.
Exactly. The panel serves as the central node in a much wider decentralized network of expertise. And the law ensures those outside consultants receive their per diems as well.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second.
Let's recap where we are.
Right. So the state has philosophically declared art a national resource. It has engineered this highly vetted, rigorously buffered, unbribable triad of experts.
And it has given them the power to consult niche specialists.
So the machine is fully built, but what happens when it catches someone?
The teeth of the law.
Yes. What happens when the panel looks at a canvas, runs their analysis, points a finger, and declares it a forgery? This is where the philosophical debate ends, and the penal code begins.
And the transition from philosophy to punishment in this law is jarring in its severity.
It's brutal.
The penalties are designed to be devastating. Section 11 lays it out.
The law dictates that any person who commits the acts of forgery shall be punished with imprisonment of, quote, not less than 6 years and 1 day, but not more than 12 years.
And a hefty fine.
Right. And they throw in a fine of 50,000 to 500,000 pesos. But let's look really closely at that minimum sentence.
The math there is very specific.
6 years and 1 day. Adding a single 24-hour period to a prison sentence isn't just some clerical quirk.
No, it's incredibly intentional.
In a lot of legal systems, that exact mathematical trigger disqualifies a criminal from probation. Are they legally guaranteeing hard time here?
That is exactly the mechanism at play. In the Philippine penal framework, a sentence of exactly 6 years or less often leaves the door open for the offender to apply for probation.
So they might just pay a fine and go home.
Right. They do some community service, pay the fine, and never see the inside of a jail cell.
But the 1 day changes that.
By setting the absolute floor at 6 years and 1 day, the legislature deliberately pushes art forgery across a critical boundary into a serious felony tier.
There is zero leniency. You forge a painting, you go to a concrete cell.
It loops back perfectly to the Declaration of Policy from Section 2.
Right. Because if the state views you as a cultural traitor who polluted the National Archive, they aren't going to give you probation.
The sheer brutality of the punishment validates the philosophy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Yeah.
The law doesn't stop at the individual holding the paintbrush. It targets the entire illicit ecosystem.
Yes, the corporate liability aspect.
This is the most fascinating legal maneuver in the entire document to me. It explicitly states that if the acts are committed by a corporation, a partnership, or any judicial entity,
The penalty shifts.
the penalty is imposed on its chief executive officer or the responsible officials.
It completely ignores the fundamental purpose of corporate law.
Right. I mean, the entire reason people form an LLC or a corporation is to build a legal blast shield between their personal lives and their business liabilities.
To protect their own assets.
If a normal corporate gallery goes bankrupt or gets sued for a standard breach of contract, the corporation takes the hit. The CEO's personal bank account and physical freedom are protected by that corporate veil.
But this law takes a sledgehammer to that veil immediately.
It just smashes right through it. Why?
Because the drafters understood that high-level art forgery is rarely a lone genius starving in a garret.
It's not just one guy in a basement.
No, it is a highly organized, heavily capitalized corporate endeavor. It involves international shipping, sophisticated marketing, shell companies, and high-end galleries.
So if a gallery operating as a registered corporation sells a verified fake, the CEO cannot hide behind the boardroom doors.
They are completely exposed.
They can't just cut a check for a fine out of the corporate treasury, shrug it off as a cost of doing business, and go back to their yacht.
The law directly targets the executive and says, you are personally looking at a 12-year prison sentence.
That is terrifying.
All right.
It drastically alters the risk calculus for executives.
It forces absolute accountability at the very top of the organizational chart.
A CEO can no longer claim willful ignorance.
I didn't know what my employees were doing. That excuse is gone.
They cannot blame a rogue, low-level acquisitions manager. If the corporate entity profits from a forgery, the executive wears the handcuffs.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the state goes one step further to ensure the ecosystem dies.
The ultimate death penalty.
The law dictates that if art dealers or the owners of art galleries commit these acts, they suffer, in addition to the prison time and the fines, the, quote, automatic revocation of their license to operate.
It's a financial excommunication. It is the permanent termination of their legal right to exist in the marketplace.
It targets the distribution network.
Right, because if you just hunt the individual painters, you are playing an unwinnable game of whack-a-mole.
There's always another painter.
Always. There is always another talented, morally flexible artist willing to replicate a master's style for a quick payout. You can arrest forgers all day and never stop the flow.
But a forged canvas is entirely worthless if the criminal has no mechanism to introduce it to the legitimate market.
Because wealthy buyers don't buy 50 million peso paintings out of the trunks of cars and alleyways.
No, they buy them from reputable, licensed galleries with nice lighting.
Exactly. So by threatening the galleries with absolute annihilation, the automatic loss of their license, the law weaponizes the gallery's own self-preservation.
It forces the galleries to do the state's vetting for them.
Yes. If I own an art gallery,
Yeah.
and I know that letting a single fake slip through my doors will not only send me to prison, but instantly and permanently destroy my business.
You're going to be very careful.
My scrutiny of every incoming canvas is going to be bordering on paranoia. I will demand provenance, I will hire my own experts, I will take zero risks.
The law effectively cuts off the oxygen supply to the black market. If the forger cannot find a gallery willing to risk selling their work, the financial incentive to create the forgery collapses.
The legislation attacks the profit mechanism, not just the act of creation. It is a brilliantly designed tactical strike.
It's incredibly thorough.
You declare art a national resource, build an unbribable panel to spot the lie, pierce the corporate veil to terrify the executives, and threaten the galleries with commercial death.
There is a catch.
There's always a catch. Operating this machinery, convening panels, hiring niche consultants, executing corporate raids, shutting down galleries, it requires an enormous amount of capital.
You cannot wage a cultural war with empty pockets.
A law is merely a suggestion if it lacks the funding to be enforced.
Which is why the final sections of the Act, specifically sections 12 through 16, are so vital. They address the mundane but critical mechanics of implementation and funding.
Section 12 is the war chest. It appropriates an initial 50 million pesos from the Organizational Adjustment Fund, specifically for, quote, the acquisition of the necessary equipment, supplies, and expertise.
50 million pesos right out of the gate is a massive commitment for 2001.
And the word equipment is crucial here.
It really is.
In 2001, and even more so today, proving a forgery beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal trial, especially against a well-funded corporate CEO with expensive lawyers, it requires more than just a 35-year-old expert squinting at a canvas.
Connoisseurship is just the necessary first step.
It's the alarm bell.
Exactly. It's the human instinct that flags a piece as suspicious. But to secure a 12-year prison sentence, You must back that human instinct with empirical, irrefutable science.
The state is fundamentally funding the creation of a highly specialized forensic laboratory for cultural artifacts.
Let's break down what that 50 million pesos is actually buying.
Okay, let's hear the shopping list.
You are looking at X-ray fluorescence machines. These peer beneath the top layer of paint to reveal the artist's original underdrawings.
Because forgers often paint over older, less valuable canvases to fake the age of the material, right?
Exactly. An X-ray reveals the hidden original painting underneath. It exposes the lie.
And you need Raman spectroscopy.
Yes, the lasers.
Right. This is a technique where a laser is fired at a microscopic sample of the paint. The light interacts with the molecular bonds of the pigment, scattering the photons and creating a unique spectral fingerprint.
It's basically DNA testing for paint.
So if a canvas is purported to be from, say, 1890, but the Raman spectrometer detects the distinct molecular fingerprint of titanium white,
A pigment that wasn't commercially available until the 1920s.
the debate is over. The science provides the smoking gun.
You also need ultraviolet light arrays to examine the varnish.
Why varnish?
Old varnish fluoresces differently than new varnish under UV. Forgers try to fake this by baking paintings or using specially tinted varnishes, but UV light cuts right through that deception.
It's amazing. And you need access to radiocarbon dating facilities to analyze the age of the canvas fibers or the wood of the frame.
The state isn't just buying magnifying glasses here. It is building a high-tech CSI unit.
And the law ensures this isn't just a one-time expenditure.
Right. They didn't just give them money once and say, good luck.
The legislation states that future funding shall be included in the General Appropriations Act of the following years.
The defense of art is permanently baked into the national budget. It institutionalizes the effort.
But the most ingenious financial mechanism is hidden in the third paragraph of the appropriations section.
The retention of funds.
Yes, it states, any and all amounts collected by the panel in the exercise of its functions shall be retained by the National Museum to augment its annual appropriations.
This is huge.
Think about how government fines usually work. If an agency fines a corporation, that money typically vanishes into the general national treasury.
It gets absorbed and spent on, highway repairs or agricultural subsidies.
It rarely returns to the agency that actually generated it.
But this law bypasses the general treasury entirely.
The money stays in-house. It creates a self-sustaining bounty system.
It really does.
If the panel and the museum orchestrate a massive sting operation, bust a corporate forgery ring, and levy 500,000 pesos in fines, that money goes directly back into the museum's war chest.
It creates a closed-loop economy dedicated solely to cultural defense.
It's brilliant incentive design.
It provides the institution with a direct, tangible financial incentive to be aggressive and highly effective.
The better they are at hunting fakes and penalizing criminals, the more capital they generate to purchase newer spectrometers and hire more specialized consultants.
They don't have to continually beg politicians for funding to pursue complex cases. Their enforcement actions generate their own revenue stream.
And who actually manages this day-to-day operation?
The bureaucrats, right?
Well, the legislature passes the law, but politicians aren't art conservators. They don't know the first thing about calibrating an X-ray fluorescence machine or drafting the specific ethical guidelines for a gallery search.
So they outsource it.
Right. Section 13 hands the operational power over to the Board of Trustees of the National Museum.
They are tasked with promulgating the implementing rules and regulations, the IRR.
This is a profound transfer of power.
It really is. The legislature builds the skeletal framework of the law, but they allow the actual subject matter experts at the museum to write the detailed operational playbook.
The historians and scientists decide how the chain of custody works for a seized painting,
They decide how the scientific testing protocols are standardized.
and exactly what proven competence looks like on the search committee's evaluation forms.
Finally, we hit the legal housekeeping in sections 14, 15, and 16.
Right, the separability clause, the repealing clause, and the effectivity clause.
These seem like dry boilerplate, but they are crucial for survival.
Why include a separability clause? Because art forgery laws intersect aggressively with private property rights and massive financial interests.
People with a lot of money to lose.
Exactly. If a wealthy gallery owner with elite lawyers gets caught, they will sue the state. They will try to find one tiny, poorly phrased sentence in the law and argue that the entire act is unconstitutional.
The separability clause acts as a firewall.
It ensures that if a judge strikes down one specific subclause, regarding, say, the exact mechanism of a fine.
The rest of the 50 million peso enforcement machine does not legally vanish overnight.
The core of the law survives the legal attack.
It's the final piece of armor on a truly formidable legal structure.
So let's look at the incredible arc of this document we've just broken down.
It's quite a journey.
It begins with a sweeping philosophical assertion that art is the irreplaceable soul of the nation.
It constructs an elite, unbribable Supreme Court of canvas.
Right. Heavily buffered from political interference and strictly rotated to prevent monopolies on truth.
It legally pierces the corporate veil to personally imprison the executives profiting from the deception.
And it financially excommunicates corrupt galleries by stripping their licenses.
All fueled by a self-sustaining, high-tech forensic war chest governed by the very experts tasked with preserving the culture.
It is an extraordinary machine built to defend history. So, to you listening out there, next time you walk into a museum or pass by a high-end gallery showcasing a masterpiece, look closer.
Because you are not just looking at oil on canvas.
You are looking at an object wrapped in invisible legal armor. You are looking at a national treasure defended by forensic laboratories, the threat of a 12-year prison sentence, and a meticulously engineered system of truth.
It highlights the extreme lengths a society must go to in order to preserve the integrity of its cultural memory.
It's inspiring in a way.
It is, but analyzing a law written in 2001 forces us to confront a looming, deeply unsettling reality about the future of that memory.
Oh, where's the vulnerability?
Well, the entire foundation of this law rests on human connoisseurship. The ultimate failsafe is the trained, intuitive eye of a 35-year-old expert possessing probity and independence of mind.
Right, the human element.
But we are rapidly entering an era where artificial intelligence can analyze and flawlessly replicate the exact brushstrokes, the microtextures, and the thematic soul of a master painter in a matter of seconds.
Oh, wow.
We are approaching a point where a machine can forge a canvas so perfectly that it defeats human intuition entirely.
That's chilling.
Will the human probity mandated in this 2001 law be enough to protect the truth when the forgery is mathematically perfect? Or will the very definition of a connoisseur have to evolve to include the algorithms we build to catch the algorithms we fear?
A machine connoisseur sitting on the panel. That is a terrifying and fascinating thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the legal defense of art. Keep looking closely at the world around you. Keep questioning the structures behind the things you find beautiful, and we will see you next time.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine buying a lost masterpiece for millions, backed by the best scientific testing in the world,
Right.
only for 3 state-appointed bureaucrats to look at it, declare it a fake, confiscate your investment, and, threaten you with a decade in prison.
Yeah, that's a terrifying prospect.
It really is. But in the Philippines, under Republic Act 9105, which is also known as the Art Forgery Act of 2001, that isn't a hypothetical. It is the literal law of the land.
It is. And today we are looking entirely at the legal, structural, and philosophical text of this legislation to answer a pretty vital core question.
Exactly. Does centralizing art authentication and criminalizing forgery through a state-appointed panel effectively protect cultural heritage, or does it create this rigid, bureaucratic monopoly over the incredibly nuanced field of art?
Right. And I argue that concentrating absolute authority in a 3-member state panel, backed by severe criminal penalties, well, it risks institutionalizing error and stifling the nuanced nature of art authentication entirely.
And I argue that the act provides a rigorous, necessary, and frankly, well-funded legal framework to definitively protect artistic resources from exploitation.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Yeah.
To understand why this law exists at all, we really have to understand what it's trying to protect, right? If you look at the foundational philosophy of the Act, specifically its declaration of policy, it states that the state has a fundamental duty to protect, conserve, and promote the nation's cultural heritage.
Which is a huge mandate.
Huge. And I think this correctly identifies a reality that many people miss, which is that art forgery is not a victimless crime.
Okay, explain that a bit more. Well, it is not just some academic dispute between wealthy collectors or like a victimless grift at an auction house. It fundamentally damages the historical record of a nation.
Right. It pollutes the timeline.
Exactly. If a forger successfully passes off a fake painting as a long-lost work by a national hero, say Juan Luna, they aren't just stealing money. They are rewriting the cultural narrative. They are polluting our shared memory of what Filipinos were feeling, expressing, and fighting for during a specific era.
I see that. I do.
So this legislation treats authentication as a serious scientific endeavor that the state has a moral and legal duty to manage, rather than just, leaving it to the whims of an unregulated market.
I completely acknowledge the noble intent there. I mean, no one, least of all me, wants the historical record polluted with fakes. But I come at it from a different way when we look at the structural mechanism the state actually chose to achieve this goal.
The panel.
Yes, the panel. Because art authentication is not math. It is highly interpretive. It relies on a really delicate triad of provenance, material analysis, and stylistic connoisseurship.
Sure.
And these are fields where the most brilliant minds in the world frequently and vehemently disagree with each other. Yet this act centralizes ultimate truth in just 3 individuals on the art authentication panel.
Well, a small panel can be efficient.
Efficient, maybe. But tying this tiny panel's highly subjective findings to draconian consequences, and we will definitely get into just how severe those are, is dangerously heavy-handed. I mean, it completely lacks the epistemic humility that the study of art history absolutely requires.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the necessity of that structure. If you look at any functioning legal or regulatory system, you eventually need a final arbiter.
Okay, but for art?
Yes, even for art. Think of this 3-member panel as a Supreme Court for cultural heritage. Just as the law requires a Supreme Court to issue a final ruling so society can move forward, the art market requires a definitive voice.
I'm not sure I agree with that analogy, but go on.
Well, think about it. Because when a forgery enters the market, the fraudster thrives on ambiguity, right? They hide behind the excuse of subjective interpretation. They say, well, my expert disagrees with your expert.
Right.
The panel removes that ambiguity entirely. And they aren't just doing this based on a gut feeling. The legislation backs them up with a massive 50 million peso initial appropriation, specifically earmarked for equipment and expertise.
Which sounds great.
They are utilizing radiocarbon dating, infrared reflectography, complex pigment analysis. The panel acts as the synthesizers of this hard scientific data.
That looks great on paper, yeah. But in practice, you are giving the state a lot of credit for what science can actually achieve in the art world.
How so? The science is pretty rigorous.
Let's break down the mechanism of that hard data. Even with a 50 million peso budget, science rarely provides absolute truth in art. Take radiocarbon dating, for example.
Okay.
You are dating the organic material of the canvas or the wood panel, not the act of painting itself.
Right, you're dating the substrate.
Exactly. So a sophisticated forger doesn't use a modern canvas. They go to a flea market in Europe, buy a worthless, amateur painting from the 1890s, scrape the paint off, and paint a masterpiece on it tomorrow using historically accurate period-appropriate pigments.
Which happens, yes.
Right. And the infrared reflectography will show an underdrawing, the pigment analysis will show 19th century lead white, and the carbon dating will say the canvas is from 1895. The science will declare the materials are real, but the art itself is entirely fake.
Which is exactly why the law requires human experts to synthesize the data, rather than just relying on a machine printout.
Exactly. It requires human interpretation. And that brings us right back to the flaw of a 3-person echo chamber. To catch that sophisticated forger, an expert has to look at the brushstrokes, the way light is rendered, the emotional resonance of the piece, pure connoisseurship.
Right.
And in the real world of art history, consensus on these subjective elements is practically a myth. You have leading scholars who will look at the exact same brushstrokes and draw completely opposite conclusions.
Well, they debate it, sure.
But by shrinking the ultimate authority to just 3 people appointed by the National Museum Board of Trustees, you are practically guaranteeing an intellectual bottleneck. If 2 of those 3 members share a particular academic bias, say, they both firmly believe a certain artist never painted with a palette knife, that subjective bias instantly becomes state law.
But the law actually anticipates that exact danger. If you look at Section 6, the text explicitly requires panel members to possess an independence of mind alongside their strict degree requirements in art conservation or connoisseurship.
Independence of mind?
Yes. It legally mandates intellectual independence to prevent that echo chamber you're worried about.
But does throwing a phrase like independence of mind into a legal document guarantee they'll actually possess it? I mean, you can verify a master's degree, you can verify someone is over 35 years age, as the law requires, but independence of mind is a behavioral trait.
It's a standard of professional integrity.
You cannot legislate a personality. And my concern with your Supreme Court analogy from earlier is that Supreme Courts usually rule on matters of legal interpretation, how a law should be applied. They do not rule on empirical, historical facts.
They rule on facts of a case all the time.
But you can't legislate whether a specific person painted a specific canvas in 1890. It either happened or it didn't. Giving 3 people the power to declare a historical fact by fiat, regardless of the broader academic consensus outside that panel, is deeply problematic.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently, because the panel doesn't operate in a vacuum forever. The legislation handles the risk of entrenched biases brilliantly through its term limits.
In Section 7, right?
Right. Members are appointed for a term of just 2 years, and they cannot serve for more than 2 consecutive terms. That turnover is the antidote to the monopoly on truth you're worried about.
I see it as the opposite.
Well, it physically prevents a single dominant personality or, an entrenched group of corrupt gatekeepers from controlling the national art market indefinitely. If we gave them lifetime appointments, the risk of institutional rot or systemic bias would be exponentially higher.
Right, but
the turnover ensures that the Supreme Court is constantly refreshed with new academic thought, younger scholars, and the latest methodological advancements.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Frequent turnover in a highly specialized technical field doesn't refresh the institution. It destabilizes it and it destroys institutional memory.
How does bringing in fresh experts destroy memory?
Because connoisseurship is not a skill you pick up at orientation. It takes decades to hone. A true expert in a specific period of national art spends their entire life building an internal visual database.
Sure, they study.
They know exactly how a specific painter's wrist flicked when painting a leaf in 1912 versus 1920. When you rotate these adjudicators out after a maximum of 4 years, just as they are establishing their procedural footing and learning how to effectively synthesize that scientific data you mentioned, you severely undermine the panel's consistency.
Well, they're already experts when they are appointed.
Even so, a gallery might have a piece authenticated in 1 year and a nearly identical piece from the same artist rejected 3 years later by a completely different panel with completely different stylistic preferences.
But if they are relying on objective standards, the consistency should remain regardless of the personnel.
But we just established the standards aren't entirely objective, and this inconsistency isn't just a frustrating academic problem. It is a terrifying legal trap for gallery owners when you look at the real-world punishments this law hands out. Which brings us to the severity of the penalties.
You're referring to the criminal and civil liabilities.
I am talking about an existential threat to the art market. If this rotating 3-person panel decides a work you are selling as a forgery, the person who commits the act faces imprisonment of not less than 6 years and 1 day and up to 12 years.
It's a serious crime.
They face fines up to 500,000 pesos. The law explicitly pierces the corporate veil, meaning if a gallery, an LLC, or a partnership is involved, these penalties bypass the corporate protection and fall directly on the chief executive officer. Their personal freedom is on the line.
Right.
But here's the most staggering part. If the acts are committed by art dealers or gallery owners, they suffer the automatic revocation of their license to operate. Automatic.
Yes, the penalties are undeniably severe. No one is arguing otherwise.
Holding a gallery owner criminally liable and destroying their livelihood over a subjective misattribution is like, well, throwing a librarian in jail because a nonfiction book they checked out turned out to have factual errors.
That's a bit of a stretch.
Imagine the chilling effect this creates. You are a gallery owner in Manila. You've spent a decade building your reputation. You do your standard due diligence on a newly discovered 19th century painting. You trace the provenance, you consult independent experts, and you genuinely believe it's authentic based on your lifelong training.
Okay.
But because art is subjective, what happens if this
3-member state panel simply disagrees with your assessment. You don't just lose the sale. You go to prison for a decade, your CEO is indicted, and your business is instantly automatically destroyed.
Well,
It forces galleries to stop looking for new, incredible pieces entirely out of self-preservation. I mean, who would take the risk of discovering and promoting previously unknown works of cultural heritage under that kind of threat?
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the severity you are describing is exactly the point. The threat is meant to be existential because the crime is existential to the nation's cultural heritage.
Existential to the gallery owner, certainly.
By imposing these strict penalties, especially piercing the corporate veil and the automatic revocation of licenses, the state effectively shifts the burden of extreme due diligence onto the dealers. It fundamentally changes the market mechanics.
By paralyzing them with fear?
By forcing them to self-regulate. Let's look at how the art market often operated before laws like this. A gallery might be presented with a painting with a questionable chain of custody.
Sure.
The financial upside of selling a lost masterpiece was massive. We are talking millions of pesos in commission. The legal downside, if it turned out to be fake, was minimal. Maybe they refund the buyer, maybe they face a civil suit, but it was essentially just the cost of doing business. The gallery could always plead ignorance.
That's a pretty cynical view of galleries.
But it happened. This act changes that calculus entirely. By threatening the very existence of the gallery and the personal freedom of its leadership, the state ensures that galleries perform their own rigorous, exhaustive, paranoid authentication before ever bringing a piece to market.
Paranoid being the operative word.
It cleans up the supply chain from the bottom up. If you aren't absolutely unequivocally certain of a piece's authenticity, you shouldn't be selling it as national cultural heritage.
That assumes a level of objective certainty that, as we've discussed at length today, rarely exists in art. You're asking gallery owners to be perfectly clairvoyant about how 3 state-appointed individuals will interpret a piece of art years down the line. It's an impossible standard.
I disagree it's impossible.
And this architecture of fear becomes even more concerning when we look at how this entire ecosystem is financed.
You mean the 50 million peso appropriation we discussed earlier?
Yes, but it's not just the initial 50 million. It's how the panel sustains itself long-term. There is a specific clause regarding the financial mechanics of this operation that we really cannot ignore.
Section 12.
Right, Section 12. It states, any and all amounts collected by the panel in the exercise of its functions shall be retained by the National Museum to augment its annual appropriations.
Which seems like a fairly standard administrative procedure to me. It ensures the panel and the museum can sustain their operations without constantly begging the legislature for more taxpayer money.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the psychological effect of that structure? When you allow a regulatory body with absolute authority to keep the fines it levies, you risk turning the National Museum into an art world bounty hunter.
Bounty hunter? Oh, come on.
You are creating a massive, perverse financial incentive. The panel has the power to declare a piece of forgery and trigger massive fines. If those fines go directly into augmenting the budget of the very institution that appoints them, there is a structural pressure to act aggressively.
I don't see it that way.
You are incentivizing the panel to find fault, to levy fines, and to self-fund through punitive action. It entirely compromises that independence of mind the law tries so hard to mandate.
You're giving the state a lot less credit than it deserves here, because you are entirely discounting the oversight built into that very same section. The law explicitly states that disbursements from those collected amounts shall be subject to the approval of the Board of Trustees of the National Museum.
Well, yes, but
The 3 panel members aren't just, pocketing the money, writing their own checks, or throwing office parties with the fines. The funds go to the larger institution to support its broader statutory mandate to protect national history. I defend this as incredibly efficient, elegant governance.
But the Board of Trustees is the exact body that appoints the panel members in the first place. It's a closed loop. The board appoints the panel levies the fines go directly to the board's budget.
The Board of Trustees of a national museum is composed of esteemed cultural leaders, academics, and public servants. Their core mandate is the preservation of heritage, not profit maximization. Framing this as a cynical, profit-seeking loop ignores the fundamental character of cultural institutions.
Institutions are still made of people, though.
True, but what this financial structure logically achieves is a system of poetic justice. The perpetrators of forgery, the criminals actively degrading the national artistic resources for their own selfish gain, are the ones mathematically forced to fund the ongoing protection of those very resources. It relieves the burden on the everyday taxpayer and places it squarely on the fraudsters.
It is only poetic justice if they are exclusively catching fraudsters. If they make a mistake, which is highly probable given the subjective nature of art and the rotating nature of the panel we talked about, it's state-sanctioned extortion of a legitimate gallery owner.
That's quite a strong accusation.
And when you combine all these elements we've discussed today, the concentrated power of 3 individuals, the rapid turnover that prevents deep institutional memory, the business-ending penalties, and the self-funding mechanism, you have a legislative architecture that relies entirely on the absolute infallibility of the panel. And human beings, especially when interpreting something as deeply complex and emotional as art, are never infallible.
But the alternative is leaving the protection of our cultural heritage to the whims of an unregulated market driven entirely by profit. A market where anyone can slap a famous signature on an old canvas, invent a fake backstory, and cash in while permanently muddying the historical record of the nation for future generations.
Nobody wants that.
Right. Republic Act 9105 steps in to say that our artistic creations are simply too important to be left unprotected. It establishes the legal teeth, the expert criteria, and the funding necessary to defend national artistic resources against increasingly sophisticated forgery. It's a definitive, uncompromising stand for historical truth.
And I maintain that while the goal is entirely valid, essential even, a 3-person panel wielding this level of absolute power, backed by automatic, business-destroying penalties and a potentially problematic self-funding loop, is a profoundly flawed approach to the nuanced world of art. The cure risks being worse than the disease if it suffocates the legitimate art market in a blanket of bureaucratic fear.
Well, despite our stark differences on the mechanics of the law, it is clear we have a vital point of convergence here. Both of us agreed that the state's mandate to protect, conserve, develop, and promote the nation's cultural heritage is a necessary pursuit. The historical record matters deeply to both of us.
Absolutely. The integrity of our cultural resources is paramount. The debate isn't about whether we should protect art, but how we manage the profound, almost impossible responsibility of declaring what is true.
Indeed. This act perfectly highlights the eternal tension between subjective artistic interpretation and the necessity for objective legal enforcement. How well this balances out in practice depends heavily on the wisdom of the implementing rules and regulations.
Very true.
Whether this functions as a necessary shield for heritage or a chilling weight on the market is something that continues to unfold. As always, we will leave it there without declaring a winner. We invite you, the listener, to examine the text of Republic Act 9105 yourself and draw your own conclusions. The next time you are in a museum, looking at that little placard next to a painting, ask yourself, who decided this was real, and what power do they hold over our shared history? Thank you for joining us.